So then we talk about social versus task cohesion, and this one's kind of interesting. It's the concept of how we spend personal time with our coworkers and our team members. It's what we do. It's how we interact. How many, by a show of hands, how many people like to go out to lunch with their coworkers? Anybody like to do that? Yeah. So what we don't know happens sometimes is that that simple practice of just going and grab a bite to eat gives us great insight into our peers and our coworkers and who we are. But it's also, when you're talking from a leadership perspective, instills a great level of trust. And so when we talk about military task cohesion versus a project management task cohesion, you'll start to see a lot of similar things going on. So training is one. Being deployed versus the project assignment is the term there. Being on a mission in the military is comparable to scope, schedule, and budget in a project. Being in a firefight is just like the risks and issues, right? You have to calculate what they are and you have to try to mitigate them as best you can. So when we talk about project recommendations and how we want to move forward with folks that are on our teams, we want to make sure that our eyes are wide open going into any engagement and working with projects. We want to make sure that we aren't shy or naive about a particular situation. You may have heard the old adage, don't assume, because it makes out of you and me. We want to make sure that we ask questions of our project sponsors so we get proper expectations. That's really, really key. And then ask yourself a simple question: can I do this? And what do you think the answer would be? It's always yes, right? It's not. I get understanding where a veteran comes from. One of my biggest frustrations is when someone says no for no's sake, and really, a no can be a real thing, but the concept is there's always alternatives to accomplishing any goal. And I think that's where you'll notice that people you might be working with that are from a veteran's background are always going to be go-getters. They're going to have a tendency to say, I don't know the answer right this second, but I'm going to try to figure it out the best that I can, and I'm going to try to make that happen. Because the answer, they've always been taught that the answer is always yes. You will get that figured out. You will accomplish that mission. You will solve that problem. So, personnel recommendations. As a project manager, I've very, very often not got the option to build my teams. Sometimes I'm lucky. There's been a few times, a couple state departments where I've been able to actually preemptively go in, speak with my project sponsor, and be able to get in front of whatever that is. But the reality is most times we're involved in a project, we don't always get to pick our team members and who we're going to be doing. Who we're going to be working with. So the first trick is to make sure that we do our assessments and assess what we're getting ourselves into and understanding who our team members are really going to be. Ask questions, lots of questions. I think the worst thing that anybody can do when it comes to project engagement is really not ask the question that may be on their mind. What is the question the only stupid question is the one not asked. I tell my team members on the projects that I'm at, you can't over-communicate with me. You can't email me too much. You can't call me or text me too much, because the reality is you may think of something that I don't think of, and you'll notice that veterans have a tendency, while they follow orders very well, they're also going to want to make sure that they're understanding what exactly is going on. But also learn more about your team and what makes them tick. I really like to, I actually have recently going through a lot of hiring, so we've been bringing a lot of folks on our team as of late. And as they come on board, I like to learn just little tidbits about them so that when I do the press release, I can embarrass them. But it's really about trying to, again, understand what motivates them, what makes them tick. And I think at a human level, we appreciate it being asked and being understood and being appreciated. So I think from a veteran perspective, you'll see that a lot of, when we talk about managing with a military mind, getting to know your team members is just going to instill that confidence that they can look up to you as a leader. Talked to that before. Communicate. Did I mention communicate? You can't over-communicate on a project because it's actually the most common failure in any project. I won't name names, but a particular State Department that made it to the paper brought me in probably about 8 years ago to head up a very large project that was already kind of on the downturn, and they knew it. And they brought me in to a room, and this was before I was hired, and they were trying to recruit me, and they sat me down, and I noticed something that was very, very obvious and telling. All the state staff for that department were on one side of the conference room table, and all the vendor staff were on the other side of that table. I don't know about you guys, but I tell my sales team all the time whenever we go into a room, don't all sit on one side. It's not an interview. It's not, Gestapo. We're not in a firing squad, right? Blend it up, mix it up. Everyone sit around and make yourselves cohesive. But what I noticed is none of them wanted to make eye contact with each other. None of them wanted to communicate with each other. 6 months later, they were in the paper and $160 million lost down the toilet. And it was really unfortunate because had maybe some ego on both sides been kind of put in check and some communication had occurred, I think there would have been great opportunity and great success for that program to be achieved. And unfortunately, here we are 8 years later, and they still haven't done the modernization of that program. And so they're, I think, going to try to reboot it here soon, but it's just unfortunate. But communication is really the easiest thing to rectify because you just have to open your mouth. You just have to be willing to, discuss things with your team members and understand where they're coming from and understand that you need to communicate the right way. I think that's also really germane to making sure that your project is successful. Email is not always the best method of communication. How many people have gotten the email that they either sent off themselves or they received and it had a certain tone to it and it just, boy, it just chapped you. You just didn't like it, right? And you fire off a response and it's a little, the tact maybe isn't quite so, appropriate or polite, and then they send another one, and next thing you know, you've got 15 emails and you're both called into the principal's office because you're just at each other's throats over email. And it all started with not understanding what the tone of maybe the original email was. I'm just as guilty. I'm just as guilty. I have a tendency sometimes to be very curt in email or in text message, and it's not coming from a bad place. It's just I'm moving usually at a pretty high rate of speed, and so my communication is usually pretty quick and curt. And so I try to remind myself that I need to put myself in the other individual's shoes and understand what the tone is from that email. And so understanding what the right method of communication is very critical. Along that lines as well is making sure that we're very keen to understand what communication will be received and how well it'll be able to be communicated back so that we're clear with what our ask is. We're not vague. We want to make sure that we're covering all of those bases as best we can. Let's see, what else? Going through this kind of quick. So in summary, remember your training. I think it's key to remember that just because you went to training doesn't mean you're not going to continue to go to training or that you're not going to repeat the training. I think it's always really important, especially if you're in the IT field or if you're in any field where you're managing big projects or big initiatives, kind of going back to the basics sometimes, just ever so, at whatever interval you feel is appropriate, to kind of check where you're at and making sure you're on the right path and you're doing things the way you remembered you were taught to do them, the things that worked. Also, that leads to the evolution and new tactics that could be developed and making sure that we're constantly looking at improvement. My little brother's in the Air Force and he has promoted extremely fast, and the reason why, aside from the fact that he's brilliant, but it's also because he's really big on trying to figure out a different way to skin the cat. He really is. He works on the A-10 Warthogs, or did. If you're not familiar with what the A-10 is, that's basically a gun with a plane built around it. And its main mission in life is to fly very, very low to the ground, and they're pretty slow. They look like they're going to fall out of the air, but they have more armament on that one plane, and they're meant for close combat, so they can get into close combat quarters and go after buildings. They can go after caves. You name it. They can put a lot of hardware right on the ground very quickly. But they're 50 years old, and they've been around since Vietnam, and so they have not figured out or developed a new plane that can do the same thing that it can do. And so my brother was able to develop a maintenance plan that basically elongates the life of the existing inventory for the next 20 years. And which, he's my little brother. I teased him all the time, but just to know that he's that brilliant and was able to do that is amazing. But I asked him, I was just curious. I said, what made you decide to do that? And he goes, honestly, they kept sending me stuff from Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was just filled with sand and this and that. And he goes, but they would wait a year to get me the plane that really needed to be worked on, probably every 3 to 6 months. And so I developed a plan that basically made sure that we're servicing the planes out in the field instead of bringing them all the way back to home base, which is on the East Coast in Georgia. And so that maintenance plan and being able to do the field maintenance out in the field before the plane, is crippled because of some actual break has elongated the life of quite a few of the planes. So it was really neat that he considered that. And he wanted an award for it. He got promoted for it. I mean, all kinds of great stuff. Then he went to rotary helicopters and did the same thing. And now he's an E8 in the Air Force and he's got his own command. So I'm really proud of him. It's pretty amazing. But it speaks to understanding that while tried and true is great, there's also an evolution and there's a growth that can occur as well. So always be open and mindful of that. This is one that I take personal. I don't like getting comfortable. I don't know if you guys are like me, but I get bored if I'm doing the same repetitious thing over and over and over and over. And so I like to mix it up just for the sake of mixing it up sometimes for two reasons. One, honestly, it's because it's fun. I want to come to work and I want to enjoy myself and I want to have a good time. But it's also because I want to make sure that I'm not getting complacent and I'm not getting comfortable. I think it's far too easy once we get into a career path of any kind that we have a tendency to want to say, okay, this is slow and steady and I like this. And I don't know if any of you are family, have families and kids, but that part of your life starts to have a big draw on you as well. And the reality is we have a tendency as people to get comfortable with what we're doing. And so mixing it up and developing new strategies is always a great idea. But being able to kind of roll with the punches is very, very important, and not being afraid to make a change once in a while. Believe in your team. I think the biggest thing that you can do for any project that you might be leading, or even if you're just leading an organization, is making sure that you believe in your team. If you're empowering them, empower them all the way. If they can't be empowered because there's a gap in training or a gap in skill set, build them up. Invest in them. Your people are critical to your success as a leader, and you want to make sure that you give them all the tools that they need to succeed. So making sure you do that is key. Take those steps to develop the trust, like we talked about, is key. And micromanagement is death. I mean, it really is. I've had, anybody had that micromanager as a boss, as a manager? We've all had them, right? I mean, the person that's just stepping on every single task that you're doing and making you second guess what you know how to do. It's not going to work. It might work in the short term, and sometimes you might need to do that for certain individuals. But for the majority of folks, you want to make sure that you're empowering them. And then communicate. That's always going to be key. I can't stress it enough. It's been one of my main monikers for many, many years that you can't over-communicate with me. My team members, a lot of them are here. They send me emails constantly throughout the day, and I do my best to respond to every single one of them, and the text messages and the calls. But the informal and the formal communications is critical, and so that's been kind of what I've been able to do. So hopefully that was good insight. I know I went kind of quick. So if there's questions, feel free to fire away. If there's not, you saved about 15 minutes of your life. So do I have any questions? And if you do, I've got to repeat them, so just let me know. No? Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.